Let's be clear about something before we even get into this. Foreign aid did not create poverty in Africa. It didn't invent colonialism, cause every conflict, or manufacture global inequality. I want to say that up front because this episode isn't an attack on aid workers or denial that real problems exist. But here's what aid did do: it shaped how Africa is understood, and that matters more than most people realize. Over the last several decades, more than $1 trillion in development aid has flowed into African countries. That money funded real things like hospitals, schools, emergency relief, vaccination campaigns. Lives were saved. I'm not dismissing that. But alongside all of that, something else was built: an entire global industry organized around poverty. Think about the scale of it. You have government agencies dedicated to foreign aid, thousands of NGOs employing highly paid professionals, consultants, contractors, grant managers, fundraising departments, and university programs training the next generation specifically for development work. This isn't small scale charity bake sales, it's an industry. And like any industry, it runs on incentives. Incentives determine what gets funded, what gets attention, and what stories get repeated. So here's the question at the center of this episode. If your funding depends on demonstrating need, what kind of stories become dominant? If urgency is what moves donors, what kind of images circulate the most? And if vulnerability is the currency, what version of an entire continent ends up on the screen? Welcome back to another episode of They Lied About Africa. I'm your host Numbe, and if nobody told you the real story, I will. This episode is part of our Reclaiming the African Story pillar, which is a pillar where we challenge the narratives we have inherited and replace them with truth, context, and power. Because today isn't about whether Africa has challenges, it's about how those challenges have been framed and who benefits from that framing. So here's a thesis for this episode. The aid industry didn't just respond to poverty, it institutionalized a narrative of African incapacity. Not necessarily because the people inside it had bad intentions, most of them didn't, but systems reward certain kinds of messaging. And over time, Africa became almost synonymous with crisis and global disclosure. Aid, charity, emergency, relief. That association didn't appear out of nowhere. It was reinforced over decades through funding structures, reporting requirements, media partnerships, and the language of international development. And when something gets repeated long enough, it stops feeling like a narrative. It just feels like reality. It shapes how investors assess risk. It shapes how governments are evaluated. It shapes how the media tells stories. And it shapes how Africans, including those of us in the diaspora, understand the continent we come from. So instead of asking the usual question, is aid good or bad? We're asking something more uncomfortable. What kind of system did large scale aid normalize? What incentives did it create? And how did those incentives shape the world's understanding of Africa? That's where we will begin. So, to understand why the aid industry expanded the way it did, we have to go all the way back to the Cold War. When many African countries gained independence in the 1960s, they didn't just get to exist. They were immediately pulled into global power struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. Both superpowers wanted influence, so they funded governments, propped up leaders, and provided loans, military assistance, and infrastructure financing. Not out of generosity, I want to say, but for geopolitical alignment. If a government leaned socialist, the Soviet bloc stepped in. If it leaned capitalist, Western governments stepped in. So money was flowing, but it was political money. And also, it's good to mention that during this period, many African governments borrowed heavily to build infrastructure, expand public services, and industrialize quickly. Then two major shocks hit in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Global interest rates rose sharply and commodity prices collapsed. Most African countries depended heavily on exporting raw materials, so when prices fell, government revenue fell with them. And at the same time, debt repayments got more expensive. Countries were suddenly caught between paying high debt, low export earnings, and shrinking foreign reserves. That's when the International Monetary Fund, otherwise known as the IMF, and the World Bank stepped in with what they called structural adjustment programs, otherwise known as SAPs. These were loans, but they came with conditions. Governments had to cut public spending, privatize state owned industries, remove subsidies, reduce tariffs, devalue their currency, and shrink the size of the state overall. The stated goal was economic stabilization. The immediate reality in many countries was something different. Public sector budgets were slashed, healthcare systems lost funding, education systems contracted, and states became significantly weaker in their ability to deliver services to their own people. And here's the critical shift. When governments pulled back from service delivery, someone had to fill that gap, of course. That's when NGOs expanded rapidly. International organizations stepped into the spaces where states had reduced their presence: health, education, rural development, food programs. What started as temporary crisis support gradually became long term parallel systems. And that is the moment where the architecture of modern development really solidified. So let me walk you through how architecture actually works today, because it's important to understand the mechanics. A donor government, like the US, the UK, Germany, France, allocates part of its national budget to foreign aid. That money gets channeled through an aid agency or multilateral institution like USAID, the World Bank, or a UN body. And those institutions then design funding priorities and create grant programs around their strategic goals, which are health, governance, climate, education. Large international NGOs or consulting firms apply for those grants, write proposals, outline measurable incomes, and build out budgets. Once approved, they either implement programs directly or partner with local NGOs inside African countries, who then carry out the actual work on the ground, often under strict reporting requirements set by people who've never been to the communities they're funding. At every single layer of that chain, there are administrative costs, compliance systems, and performance indicators that must be met to keep funding coming. And because funding is almost always time bound, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, programs are designed to produce short term measurable outputs. Long term institutional strengthening is much harder to quantify. Tax reform doesn't fit neatly into a quarterly report. Building state capacity doesn't produce the kinds of metrics that impress a donor board. So, projects become the unit of development, not institutions, and reporting flows upwards to donors, not downward to citizens. Now, combine that structure with what structural adjustment already did. States shrank, NGOs expanded, donor funding became normalized, and project based development became the default model. Externally funded, project driven, time bound, metrics based, designed more often than not outside the country it was meant to serve. When that model operates for decades, it shapes expectations and it shapes perception. Solutions appear to come from outside, expertise appears imported, funding appears imported, and gradually the global conversation stops framing Africa as a continent rebuilding institutions after decades of geopolitical pressure and debt crises. Instead, it becomes a continent that simply and continuously receives intervention. That's not an accident, it's the logical output of the system we just mapped. So once you understand the architecture, the narrative stops looking accidental. The aid system is built around demonstrated need. If you're applying for funding, you cannot submit a proposal that says things are improving steadily. That doesn't move donors. You have to show gaps. You have to quantify vulnerability. You have to make the urgency legible on paper. And when you secure funding, your renewal depends on continuing to justify it. That's not a conspiracy. It's just how the incentive structure works. But when thousands of organizations are all operating under the same logic, what becomes the most visible in global disclosure? Malnutrition rates, infant mortality statistics, governance failures, conflict metrics, poverty thresholds. And what becomes nearly invisible? Functional municipal systems, domestic innovation, tax reform, private sector expansion, industrial policy. None of those things raise money fast enough. Crisis mobilizes attention in ways that competence simply does not. When this pattern repeats across decades, it hardens into shorthand. Africa becomes strongly associated with aid, relief, intervention, and development work. Not because that's the full picture, but because that's the picture the funding structure kept producing and circulating. And that association doesn't stay contained to fundraising campaigns. It bleeds into everything. Investors assess risk based on long term signals. Capital flows towards perceived stability and withdrawals from perceived fragility. So, when the dominant narrative around the region has spent decades emphasizing instability and dependency, markets read that as a structural risk and price it accordingly. That affects how much it costs African governments to borrow. It affects which industries attract foreign investment and which don't. It affects growth trajectories in ways that are genuinely hard to unwind. It also shapes media coverage. Major humanitarian crises dominate the headlines. Images of suffering circulate globally and get shared and reshared until episodic events start to feel like permanent identity. Africa gets discussed primarily as a set of problems rather than as a collection of complex, evolving economies with their own internal dynamics. And that framing then shapes foreign policy, academic research, diplomatic posture, and how multinational firms decide whether to enter a market. Here's what makes it so difficult to disrupt. The framing persists even when reality changes, even when reform occurs, even when the growth improves, and even when domestic industries expand. The dominant lens was built over decades and it doesn't update quickly. Poverty moves from being a condition, something that exists in a specific place at a specific time, to being the primary frame through which an entire continent is interpreted. And once a frame becomes an infrastructure, it stops feeling like a choice, it just feels like the truth. And that's the real problem we're dealing with. Now we got to talk about accountability and sovereignty, because development isn't just about delivering services. At its core, it's about who holds leverage, and to understand that, you have to understand how revenue shapes political relationships. In political economy, there's a fairly well-established principle. Governments that rely on domestic taxation have to negotiate with their citizens. When revenue comes from the people can demand something in return, such as services, infrastructure, transparency, accountability. Taxation creates a direct link between what the state takes and what it owes. But when a meaningful portion of public financing comes from external sources like grants, concessional loans, donor programs, that link gets complicated. Policy priorities start aligning with funding frameworks. Administrative systems orient around donor reporting and compliance. Benchmarks get defined outside of the country. The accountability relationship that's supposed to run between citizen and state now has a third party sitting in the middle of it. And instead of a straight line between the people and their government, you get a triangle. Citizens, governments, and donors. And in that triangle, donors often hold more structural leverage than citizens do because they control the money. Now layer that onto everything structural adjustment already did. Public sectors contracted. State employment shrank, national institutions were weakened, and external funding expanded into the spaces that states left behind. Development became organized around projects rather than durable institutional reform, and that distinction matters enormously. Projects operate in cycles. They have start dates, end dates, and deliverables. Institutions require sustained political commitment and long-term fiscal investment. When project logic dominates planning, continuity becomes fragile. When a program collapses or a funding cycle ends, responsibility is scattered across ministries, NGOs, contractors, and donors. Nobody is clearly accountable, but everyone is partially accountable, which in practice means nobody is. Domestic political elites adapt to these incentives too, and that's an uncomfortable thing to name, but it's important. If external financing is reliably supplementing your budget, the political urgency to aggressively expand your domestic tax base weakens. If donor benchmarks determine whether funding continues, policy energy naturally shifts towards satisfying those benchmarks rather than building the kinds of institutions that would eventually make external financing unnecessary. Sovereignty becomes layered, part domestic, part externally financed, and layered sovereignty has real consequences in how a country is perceived and treated globally. Credit rating agencies assess fiscal independence when they assign sovereign ratings. Bond markets price risk based on perceived structural stability. Foreign direct investment responds to how self-sufficient a government appears. Trade negotiations reflect bargaining power, and countries that are structurally dependent often negotiate from weaker positions, facing higher borrowing costs and being treated as stabilization cases rather than as emerging economic actors with leverage of their own. What you end up with over time is a feedback loop that's genuinely hard to escape. External financing supplements capacity. Supplemented capacity reinforces perceptions of fragility. Perceived fragility sustains intervention frameworks. Intervention frameworks normalize external centrality. And the system settles into itself, shaping not just aid conversations, but borrowing terms, investor confidence, and the long-term trajectory of capital flows into and out of the continent. Now we gotta talk about the diaspora capital consequence. Because capital responds to signals, and when governments issue bonds, investors evaluate ratings and decide what the interest rate and risk warrants. When firms consider entering a market, they look at long-term indicators of stability. The narrative around a region, what gets repeated, what becomes a default association, is just one of those signals, which means everything we've talked about so far doesn't just affect aid conversation, it affects money. But capital doesn't only move through global markets, it also moves through people. And this is where the diaspora enters the picture. Remittances from the African diaspora now exceed official development assistance in many African countries. In some cases, they're one of the largest sources of foreign currency coming in. That's a remarkable thing when you sit with it. Ordinary people sending money home are outpacing entire government aid programs, and those transfers do real tangible good. They stabilize households, cover school fees, pay rent, fund medical bills, keep families afloat. They are genuine lifelines for millions of people. But here's the tension. Remittances are not structured like investment. They don't build industrial capacity. They don't finance large scale productive infrastructure. They don't expand domestic tax bases or create the kind of capital formation that compounds over time into structural economic strength. They cushion vulnerability, which matters enormously. But cushioning vulnerability and building productive capacity are two different things. So if we compare the three main external flows into African economies, aid, remittances, and foreign direct investment, what you notice is that each one has a structural ceiling. Aid is compliance driven and externally designed. Remittances are privately sent and consumption oriented. Foreign direct investment is risk sensitive and profit driven, meaning it pulls back the moment perceived instability rises. What's largely missing is a large scale domestic capital accumulation, capital that's controlled internally, reinvested locally, and not subject to the conditions or risk calculations of outside actors. And this is where the narrative problems connects directly to the economic problem. When the dominant image of Africa is fragility and dependency, investor caution increases, including among diaspora members who love the continent but have absorbed that framing their entire lives. Investment decisions become hesitant. Business ventures get framed as helping rather than as straightforward profit opportunities. Entrepreneurship becomes charity adjacent. Capital that enters expecting instability demands higher returns to compensate for the perceived risk, or it stays away entirely. That's the deeper consequence of decades of crisis framing. The frame doesn't just describe economic reality, it conditions economic behavior. It shapes how risk is priced, how capital moves, and ultimately how hard structural transformation becomes. When fragility is assumed, capital acts as though fragility is permanent. And when capital acts that way, it becomes a little more permanent each time. This is why reframing isn't just a cultural conversation, it's an economic one. Now, we gotta reframe the frame. Because the phrase, which you might have heard or said yourself, Africa needs development, may sound neutral, right? It's not. It assumes development is something delivered from outside. It assumes deficiency as the starting point. It positions an external model, usually a Western one, as the reference that Africa is measured against and found lacking. When people say Africa needs development, what they actually mean, even if they don't realize it, is more aid, more NGOs, more technical assistance, more programs. Development and intervention have become so synonymous in global disclosure that people use them interchangeably without noticing. But development is not intervention. Development is structural transformation. It's the expansion of productive capacity. It's the strengthening of domestic tax systems. It's the growth of industries that generate surplus and keep it local. It's institutional durability, governments that can plan past a 5 year funding cycle because they're not dependent on one. It's fiscal sovereignty, the ability to finance your own priorities without conditions attached. And here's something worth sitting in. No country in history developed primarily through perpetual external service delivery. Name one, I bet you cannot. The countries we now call industrial powers built tax systems, developed manufacturing bases, reinvested domestic capital, negotiated trade terms that protected their emerging industries, and expanded state capacity before they even talked about shrinking it. Development was internal capacity compounded over time, not charity scaled up. So, if poverty has been organizing the frame, what would an alternative frame actually look like in practice? It would start with productive sectors, not deficits. It would measure manufacturing output alongside malnutrition rates. It would center domestic revenue growth, not donor disbursement volumes. It would ask different questions entirely, like how do we expand internal capital? How do we deepen industrial ecosystems? How do we raise tax to GDP ratios? How do we reduce borrowing costs by building genuine fiscal strength? And how do we retain surplus locally instead of watching it leave? Development is not the presence of NGOs, it's the presence of domestic capital formation. It's the ability to finance infrastructure without conditional dependency. It's the ability to borrow at reasonable rates because markets view you as structurally stable, not as a stabilization case. It's the ability to walk into a trade negotiation without structural vulnerability determining the outcome before you sit down. If the dominant model has been project based, externally financed, and compliance driven, the alternative has to be institution based, domestically financed, and sovereignty driven. The question stops being how do we improve aid effectiveness and becomes how do we expand domestic economic power. The conversation moves from vulnerability management to capacity accumulation, from assistance to autonomy, from survival metrics to structural strength. That's the shift. And I want to be honest with you, It's not a simple one. The system we've been describing wasn't built overnight, and it won't be dismantled overnight. But the frame always comes first. You can't build towards something you can't yet imagine. So, part of what this show exists to do is make that imagination possible, to show what becomes visible when you stop leading with crisis and start leading with capacity. When the frame changes, the strategy changes. And when the strategy changes, power moves. That's all I have for you on today's episode of They Lied About Africa. Be sure to follow us on our social media platforms at They Lied About Africa on Instagram and TikTok to see reformatted episode clips. And until next week.